In August 1956, behind the Magnolia Room restaurant at 231 Meeting Street, Charleston, the wooden door leading down to the secret meeting room of the South Carolina KKK chapter had just closed when the atmosphere also sank, thick and heavy. Henry Red Jack Hargrove, the notorious Grand Dragon of the state, sat at the head of the table, next to him the county sheriff, an extremist preacher, and several large landowners of the area. This was their domain, where they believed white skin was the only law. When the door opened, the entire room fell silent. Bumpy Johnson stepped in, without bodyguards, just quietly pulling out a chair and sitting down. He had been invited to negotiate about the shipment route, passing through KKK-controlled territory, but no one in the room knew that the real reason Bumpy was there tonight was not on the table at all. Hargrove looked at Bumpy, smirking. "Your Harlem always thinks it's civilized. Truth is, it's just a slum wearing perfume." The room burst into laughter, the kind of smug, cheap laughter, like a reflex of those used to standing over others. Then he turned in a different direction, the direction all 17 men in the room knew was forbidden ground. "And your mother," Hargrove deliberately slowed down. "Your mother must be real good at kneeling. Black skin and all, born to serve us." The laughter died instantly, because everyone in the circle knew you could insult Bumpy's money, Bumpy's clothes, Bumpy's status, even Harlem itself. He would let it slide, or handle it by street rules. But Bumpy Johnson's mother, that wasn't an insult. That was a suicide declaration. Bumpy didn't turn. He just looked. A look without anger, carrying the silence of a verdict that had already fallen the moment those words came out. Hargrove still tried to smile, but the corners of his mouth began to tremble, because he realized what every instinct of a man who lives by violence understands clearly. He had just crossed a line no one could save him from. In that moment, the story no longer had anything to do with the rote or negotiations. What had just shifted was Hargrove's fate, and Bumpy Johnson was the one setting the rhythm of that shift. Ellsworth Raymond, Bumpy Johnson, was born in 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina, where black people grew up under the constant fear of the Jim Crow era. From childhood, he witnessed black men being thrown into police wagons just for daring to raise their heads, black women chased out of stores as if they weren't human, black children kicked into the street for blocking the way. Those things didn't scare Bumpy. They made him awake. He learned to observe, to read eyes, to anticipate others' actions, to quietly remember everything the oppressors never thought a black child could learn. The biggest influence on him was his mother, Margaret Johnson. She worked in white people's homes, hands full of calluses, voice always calm but firm. She taught him 3 things that later became unbreakable laws in his life. Never let anyone look down on where you come from. Charleston was poor, full of injustice, but she taught him origin wasn't a sentence. Never let anyone insult your family, because in a world where black people were constantly oppressed, family was the last stronghold, and the most important. When you have power, keep the balance. Don't take revenge on the weak. Don't step on others to prove yourself. Use power to keep everything in its rightful place. Those 3 sentences followed him to Harlem, and in a chaotic Harlem where Italian mafia, corrupt police, and numbers bosses fought for every inch of street, Bumpy chose a different path, using his mind to build power. He didn't threaten others with violence. He made them wary with his ability to see farther than they could, with knowing too many things they didn't want anyone to know, with staying calm when others lost control. Bumpy created a kind of power that nightly gunmen could never have: respect. That's why he became the king of Harlem, not because he was stronger than anyone, but because he understood people and the rules of the game better than all of them. that stood in complete opposition to the kind of power held by Henry Red Jack Hargrove, Grand Dragon of the South Carolina KKK. Hargrove ruled through fear. He relied on lynchings to intimidate, used burning crosses to mark territory, used fake superiority to turn the law into his personal tool. His power was loud, chaotic, and existed by crushing those who couldn't fight back. Bumpy's power was the opposite, silent, precise, based on real loyalty. So when he stepped into the Magnolia Room, Bumpy only needed to stand still for all 17 white men to feel the difference between those two kinds of power. After the insult earlier, the room thought Bumpy's silence meant he was cornered. But in his eyes, there was no trace of anger or fear, only the calm of a man who had weighed everything long before setting foot here. Hargrove didn't see that. He leaned back in his chair, voice full of contempt. I hear in Harlem, you're a big man. Here it's different. Here we decide who goes, who stays, who lives, who disappears. A few KKK guys laughed, thinking the atmosphere had tilted their way. Hargrove continued, voice rising. You came here because you need us. Don't forget that. Bumpy looked at him, eyes still calm but voice cold enough to cut through the room's arrogance. I didn't come because I need. Hargrove started to retort, but when he saw Bumpy's gaze didn't waver, he froze. Just a moment, but enough for the room to sense something slipping from the hands of the man they once thought untouchable. The change on Hargrove's face happened too fast, but everyone present noticed. He no longer felt sure he was talking to just some man from Harlem. The Magnolia Room fell into an unnatural silence after the insult. Henry Hargrove still tried to hold his smile, but it was no longer the smile of someone in control. Bumpy Johnson sat leaning back in his chair, eyes unchanged, face showing no emotion. Hargrove cleared his throat, trying to regain aggression. You think you scared? This is South Carolina. Here, what just happened is only the opening words. He waited for a reaction. Bumpy stayed silent, that calm unnerved the men in the room. Men used to seeing men cry, women beg, black people run. Then Bumpy spoke. Is your daughter doing okay? The whole room turned to Hargrove. His face lost color instantly. Bumpy continued. I hear she's studying at Duke. Good effort. Even if her scholarship doesn't come from a source you're proud to brag about to others. One Klan guy frowned. What does he mean, Red Jack? Bumpy answered for him. The scholarship funded by Mr. Rosenberg, a Jewish man. The one you guys burned his store in 1953. Hargrove swallowed hard. How? How do you know about that? Bumpy tilted his head, as if the question only proved one thing. Hargrove didn't understand who he was sitting in front of. He didn't answer but turned to the sheriff. Your wife was planning to leave you. Last week, you hit her after losing money at Trask's gambling spot. I heard her crying on the porch. The sheriff bowed his head, face pale. Another man slammed his hand on the table. Don't make shit up. Bumpy looked straight at him. April 4th, your son got expelled from school. Not for bad grades, for beating someone in the bathroom. I even know the name of the kid he beat. A sharp gasp sounded. The man pulled his hand back from the table, sweat running down his temple. Then Bumpy named the next one. He recited every address, every debt, every envelope received. Every assault they thought was covered up. He spoke dates clearly, as if reading from their own notebooks. The extremist preacher in the corner was the fourth named. Bumpy said, You took $600 from the church to pay off drinking debts. Knew you? The preacher clasped his hands, not sure if praying or terrified. Faces changed with each of Bumpy's words, from discomfort to tension, then to clear fear. Not because they feared exposure, but because they didn't understand how a man they thought was just some black guy from Harlem knew everything. Bumpy didn't threaten. He was clear as a knife slicing through their layers of defense, because every sentence he spoke was proof that control in the room no longer belonged to them. Hargrove tried to stay calm, but his hands visibly shook. "What do you want?" he asked, this time with no aggression or superiority in his voice. Bumpy looked straight at him. "I want to talk." Hargrove gave a bitter laugh. "Talk? After everything you just threw in our faces?" Bumpy remained composed. "If I wanted anything else, you wouldn't be sitting here tonight." One sentence that made the whole room shudder, not because it threatened, but because they 100% believed what he said was true. Then Bumpy folded his hands in front of him, as if starting the most important part. "I know about your daughter. I know about your house. I know what everyone in this room has done, not to threaten you." He paused a second, "but to make you understand. I'm not under your power." One Klan guy jumped up. "We're not letting some." He didn't finish. Hargrove raised a hand to stop him. For the first time, the Grand Dragon of the entire state didn't want to make things worse. Bumpy leaned back in his chair and smiled lightly, a smile not of joy, but like a final reminder he knew exactly who they were. Some bowed their heads to the table. Some avoided looking at each other. Some muttered curses so low only they heard, but all understood the same thing. They had misjudged the man sitting before them, badly, and since Bumpy had started speaking, they knew one thing for sure: he hadn't finished. Because what they just heard was only the tip of the iceberg, and what lay beneath the surface, what Bumpy brought to the Magnolia Room tonight, was what made every man in the room feel a chill down their spine. Bumpy's smile faded, and the Magnolia Room fell into a thick silence. No one dared look straight at him anymore. Hargrove tried to hold calm. Bumpy didn't speak right away. He let the silence stretch, as if letting the room feel the weight of what was coming. Then he began, voice clear. 20 years, Bumpy said, eyes never leaving Hargrove. 20 years you thought you covered every trace. The room stiffened in unison. No one knew where he was going. The church burning in Orangeburg. One man in the corner slid his chair back a few inches as if kicked in the chest. Bumpy continued. Night of February 12th, 1947. Mount Calvary Church. 3 children burned to death. 2 were Pastor Bennett's kids. 1 lived 7 more hours in the hospital. One of the oldest Klan guys put a hand to his mouth, hand visibly shaking. No one spoke, but the air shifted as if someone had pulled back the curtain on a secret they all thought buried. You thought it was a fire from a fallen worship candle. Bumpy looked straight at him. I know the 2 who lit it. I know which gas station the fuel came from. I know which cop signed off on the report that day. Hargrove opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came. Bumpy moved to the next. The 17-year-old boy you hanged near Riverside Park. Another in the room tried to look away, but Bumpy caught it. August 3rd, 1951. His name was Marcellus Green, only son. His mother cried until she lost her voice. I know who dragged him from the house. I know the rusty truck you used. Hargrove braced both hands on the table, trying to steady his voice. Don't make up old finished business. Bumpy tilted his head. I have the names of the 4 who stood around the tree. I have a confession from one of them. Recorded 5 years ago. The room seemed to stop breathing. The youngest Klan guy glanced around, clearly wondering if he was next. But Bumpy wasn't done, and the erased files he continued. The sheriff in the room jerked back as if a gun was pointed. Night of June 14th, 1952. A boy beaten, 2 ribs broken after dropping a white person's bag. You erased the report. You told the nurse not to log it in admissions. I met her last year. Sweat ran down the sheriff's neck. He swallowed, but his throat caught. Bumpy paused. You thought I came here just because of one insult, he said. But I came because of all of this. Hargrove leaned back, face pale and flushed at once, eyes blinking fast as if searching for an escape. Bumpy pulled out a small device, a sleek black tape recorder. He set it on the table, tape facing Hargrove. Remember the meeting in the warehouse near Great Branch Swamp? Hargrove's eyes widened. Then, as if answering the horror in those eyes, Bumpy pressed play. A faint hiss sounded. Then Hargrove's voice, clear, undeniable, came from the small speaker. We took 500 from the plantation owner. If he fights back, we torch the barn. What law? My law. This town fears me more than God. A few in the room looked at each other in panic, as if that voice was proof they'd just signed their own death warrant. The recorder continued. Those black folks think they're protected. We beat whoever we want. No one touches the Klan. Hargrove's roaring laugh from the recording echoed through the Magnolia Room, making it even scarier to you all because he couldn't laugh anymore. Bumpy turned it off. He left the device on the table. The light clink carried the weight that froze the entire room. The sheriff bowed his head. The preacher clutched his cross tighter. Hargrove stared at the machine like it was a blade at his throat. Bumpy looked around the room, eyes silent but razor sharp. I don't need to yell. I don't need to bring anyone. I came here alone, and I know everything. Bumpy didn't just turn the tables. He showed them that all these years they thought they were hunting, but they were the ones being tracked. And tonight, the darkness they created had turned back on them. 3 years before Bumpy stepped into the Magnolia Room, the real story had begun. At that time, his nephew, Cornelius Johnson, 23, Columbia University journalism graduate, returned to South Carolina to investigate the chain of missing black people that mainstream press never reported. Cornelius was a good kid, bright, raised believing truth could change the world, but he also inherited the Johnson stubbornness, the trait that made him dare return to the South when the KKK was at its most vicious. In his last letter to Bumpy, Cornelius wrote in a light slant, "Uncle Bumpy, I think there's a cop behind these disappearances here. I'm digging deeper. I won't stop." That was the last time Bumpy read his nephew's voice. A week later, Cornelius's body was found at the edge of Santee Forest, head traumatized, ribs broken, clothes torn as if a hateful lesson. The county sheriff called it a hunting accident. Local paper ran 3 lines, no photo. But those living in South Carolina knew no one falls to death in that forest, and the one who ordered the cover-up, the one behind that death, could only be one man. Henry, Red Jack, Hargrove. At the funeral in Harlem, Cornelius lay in a light wood coffin, face no longer whole from wounds. Mourners wept, especially his little sister, but Bumpy stood still, hand on the coffin edge, no tears, no trembling, no words, through the service. Until everyone stepped back, he bowed low and spoke the only sentence, voice low, like heated iron, "Uncle will show them what justice looks like." From that moment, a journey began, not loud, not showy, not a single shot fired. For 3 years, Bumpy quietly rebuilt every piece of truth. He talked to black preachers, heard them tell of families losing husbands, sons in silence. He sought out threatened journalists who once dared write about the KKK, then quit or fled the state. He found white people living in fear, quietly opposing the Klan, but never daring to speak. People who knew secrets, the KKK thought buried. He even found 2 ex-Klan members betrayed and beaten by their own men who understood the organization's power structure too well. He listened to every word, memorized every detail, every address, every date, patient, as if playing the longest chess game of his life. Each piece of information a move, each witness a step. 3 years later, he held what even the FBI didn't have, a full crime map of South Carolina KK, including burnings, disappearances, involved cops, secret meetings, bribes, assaults, cold-blooded oaths, and at the center of that map, the intersection of every line, every decision, every crime, only one name, Henry Hargrove. When Bumpy walked into the Magnolia Room that night, many thought he came to negotiate the route, or avenge the insult. They thought too simply. They didn't know for 3 years Bumpy had lived with a goal like a shadow on his back. No one in the room knew he came, not because of Hargrove's words, but because of the death of a child whose name they never remembered. So when Hargrove asked in a trembling voice, "What did you come here for?" Bumpy just leaned back. "I came for a kid you killed 3 years ago." The room swayed as if the floor shifted. Half the Klan guys shuddered, fear making them cover their mouths. The other half tried not to meet Bumpy's eyes, because they understood that sentence wasn't an accusation, it was a declaration. And when Bumpy Johnson declared something, it meant it had been decided long ago. 3 years preparing for this moment, 3 years building a verdict he only began to reveal tonight. And everyone in the Magnolia Room felt it clearly. The truth was no longer in their hands, it was in the hands of the black man, who just spoke those words, with a voice that didn't shake, didn't tremble, didn't need to threaten, because that night, justice didn't wear a judge's robe. Justice wore a fedora, and carried the Johnson name. Among the names in Bumpy's 3-year journey, there was one no one expected. Deputy Sheriff Samuel Green, a white man born and raised in the very land the Klan ruled. Green wasn't a hero, he was just the only lawman who witnessed Cornelius being dragged onto a truck, surrounded by white hoods. He stood in the shadows, powerless except to burn the image into memory, a memory that kept him awake, night after night, eyes closed, hearing Cornelius cry in the woods. Green was threatened right after. His house painted with race traitor, his daughter followed to school, his car windows smashed, chicken coop torched. Once, Hargrove stood right at his door, leaned close and said, "You know what happens if you open your mouth." Green didn't speak for the first 3 months. Then one day, he quietly wrote a letter to Harlem, unsigned, only saying, "I know what happened to the boy. Meet me." Bumpy appeared in an abandoned warehouse outside Columbia. Green's hands shook, handing over the first envelope. List of cops taking Klan bribes, list of businessmen funding lynchings, list of politicians dining with Hargrove. "Why are you helping me?" Bumpy asked. Green swallowed hard, then answered very low, "Because I'm the only one still alive who saw him die, and I haven't slept since." In the following months, Green became Bumpy's most important source. He provided maps of secret forest meetings, detailed notes on who attended. He gave lists of Klan members purged internally for talking too much. But most important was the first recording. Proof Hargrove directly participated in assaults. Green hid a recorder under the wooden platform at a Klan meeting, right before Hargrove stepped up to preach about white power. It was the first time Bumpy heard Hargrove's voice without crowd noise. "We make whoever we want disappear. Here the law is mine," Green said, almost choking. "If they know I did this," Bumpy answered short, "I know," but his eyes held no pity, only confirmation that Green had crossed a line he couldn't return from. And then the Magnolia Room night came. Green stood at the back, trying to make himself smallest. Hargrove glanced at him once, never suspecting a traitor stood feet away, and Bumpy, while speaking of buried secrets, glanced at Green once, a very slight nod, just enough for Green to understand, time for truth to step out of shadows, but enough to make a few others in the room flinch. They realized Bumpy didn't come alone. One clan guy looked at Green, then whispered to Hargrove, "Red Jack, what's with him?" Green heard but didn't answer. He looked at his hands, knowing tonight was the point of no return. Hargrove finally noticed that look. He narrowed his eyes. "Green, what the hell are you doing?" Green answered low but clear, "I'm just doing what's right." A traitor inside the clan, at the most important table, was something Hargrove never imagined. But that moment exposed the biggest truth. The clan's power was no longer absolute as they thought. And because one white man dared stand for justice, not for power, but haunted by a young man's death, the story tonight was no longer just Bumpy Johnson versus Hargrove. It was a clash between two worlds, one living on hate and one living on justice that arrives no matter how late. Deputy Samuel Green was the first crack in the wall the clan thought would never fall, and Bumpy Johnson was the one turning that crack into a total collapse. No one in the Magnolia Room knew what Bumpy would say next, but all felt clearly that what was coming wouldn't be like anything they'd ever heard. When he spoke, "You will apologize to my mother." Bumpy said each word clearly, just one sentence, and the room shook. No one dared look at Hargrove. Bumpy continued, "Not in front of me, but in front of the person you despise most." Hargrove's eyes twitched non-stop. He understood what that meant, but he didn't want to believe what he just heard. Bumpy leaned lightly back, voice unchanged. "You will write a letter to Reverend William Carver." The room reeled. Carver was the only white preacher in the area openly supporting equality, the one the clan once burned a church to warn. Forcing a grand dragon to bow before that man wasn't just humiliation, it was tearing off the mask of power Hargrove had worn for years. "In the letter," Bumpy said slowly, "you will state clearly the crimes you committed, not part, all. You will mention the words you spoke tonight." The room made no sound. "And you will apologize to Margaret Johnson." Bumpy's mother's name rang out. Hargrove shook his head hard, mouth moving, but no words formed. He tried to summon his old authority, but his eyes now held only panic. You're crazy." He tried to shout, but the sound came weak and trembling. "I'll never." "You will," Bumpy cut in. Everyone felt the weight of that sentence drop like a boulder. Bumpy said no more, just looked straight at Hargrove. The aggression vanished. The superiority vanished. The confidence vanished. At the end of the table, the extremist preacher closed his eyes like awaiting execution. The sheriff wiped sweat from his brow. Another man tried to look up but couldn't meet Bumpy's eyes. Hargrove nearly collapsed into his chair. He tried to say something like protest. "I am the Grand Dragon. I can't." But the words died when he saw Bumpy slightly tilt his head, as if asking if he was sure he wanted to resist. It was just reality, placed squarely before him, and he knew there was no way back. Every word Bumpy spoke landed like a hammer on the clan's power coffin. This wasn't about humiliating the opponent. This was stripping the pillars of the KKK empire by forcing its leader to kneel in silence. One clan guy started to speak, but Hargrove raised a hand to stop him, not to save face, but because he knew resisting would only deepen the humiliation. Hargrove finally managed a sentence, voice hoarse. "If I do, you'll let me go, right?" Bumpy didn't answer right away. He looked at him a few seconds, then said, "I'll let you face what you've done." Hargrove understood the real meaning, and he nodded, a heavy nod, as if even he didn't realize he'd just done the unimaginable. The room stayed in absolute silence as Bumpy pushed his chair back. A light scrape sounded, but even that made many jump as if hearing a gunshot. Hargrove bowed his face, hands gripping the table like afraid of falling. Reverend Carver was the man he hated most, the one the Klan tried to silence for years. Yet now, he had to apologize to that man, instead of begging for mercy. Bumpy stood, walked to the door. When the door opened, hallway light spilled into the dark room, and Bumpy faded from sight. One obvious truth spread across every face: tonight was far from over. After the Magnolia Room night, Henry Hargrove was no longer the grand dragon roaring on a wooden platform. He became a man short of breath, jumping at every knock, not daring to look in mirrors for fear of seeing truth in his own eyes. He ordered 2 close Klan guys to prepare a car. "I need to go for a few days." He said that, but everyone knew he was fleeing something he dared not name. The KKK arranged a route to get him out of South Carolina, through Georgia first, where a smaller chapter could hide him in secret. They believed once he left the Magnolia Room, Hargrove's power would return. But what they didn't know was once the verdict opened, running anywhere was useless. Hargrove hid in a cheap motel near Savannah, mold smell clinging to his clothes after one night. He kept turning off lights, never sleeping a full hour, but looking at the empty parking lot, he told himself he was still safe. He didn't know Bumpy had someone right at the gas station where he stopped. A black truck driver, head down like just pumping gas but eyes tracking every move. Into Alabama, he stayed in an old wooden church, hidden by an extremist preacher in the basement. They burned a cross in the woods that night, to boost morale, to remind themselves the Klan still had power. But at the forest edge, a black preacher stood watching, hearing every slogan, noting every face in the firelight to send back to Bumpy. In Mississippi, he stayed in a rundown motel on Route 49. Damp smell soaked the walls, tap water ran brown. But he still believed this was the safest place yet. He planned to stay a week, then move to Louisiana, where he had police contacts. But at the front desk, the white woman with curly brown hair handed him the key, while glancing at the envelope he carried. She didn't know who he was, but the postal worker she knew did, and that person had sent word to Harlem 3 days earlier. Throughout Hargrove's escape, Bumpy's network ran smoothly like a silent machine. A Jewish shop owner in Charleston noted the license plate. A signal light repairman in Augusta saw him change plates. A young cop in Montgomery, wanting out of the Klan, secretly directed him, then sent info back to Bumpy's people. None understood the full picture, but each piece Bumpy placed correctly. Along the way, there were stops where Hargrove didn't know he was watched from afar. A tall man under a streetlight, or a black boy pretending to play ball but eyes always on his car. Hargrove feared Bumpy would kill him, but the truth was worse. Bumpy didn't need to get close. He just needed to know where he'd go. And he always knew. On the second night in Mississippi, Hargrove stepped into the motel hallway, looked into the dark, and whispered, "I got away." He didn't know Jackson, where he thought safest, was the final trap, because Mississippi was then the FBI's investigation center after Emmett Till's murder. Federal agents had opened new KKK files. They were hunting evidence for charges. They needed a piece, and Hargrove was that piece. When his old Pontiac turned onto the red dust road to the Jackson lodging, a man stepped from shadows and watched. He didn't chase, didn't call, didn't report, just stood a few seconds, then turned away. because his job was only to confirm one thing. Hargrove had arrived exactly where Bumpy wanted. Right time, right place. Every escape route led to Jackson, not because Hargrove was smart, but because it was the only path Bumpy left open. The timing was ripe. Everything needed had aligned. And in Mississippi's darkness, amid night chill and pale yellow streetlights, the story was no longer where Hargrove ran. The story was Bumpy Johnson had waited for him at the end from the day he began running. The old wooden house on Jackson's Edge, Mississippi, lit only by a weak yellow bulb on the porch. Inside, Henry Hargrove sat against the wall, clutching a pistol, eyes darting. Two loyal Klan members sat beside him, but even they no longer believed in the power of the man who once ruled a region. Hargrove said nothing for hours. He just muttered, "He'll come. I know he'll come." Then footsteps sounded. One Klan guy jumped up, peeked through the curtain. No one. He turned, but the words barely left when the back door opened. Bumpy stepped in, his shadow covering the small room. No one knew how he entered. Bumpy looked at Hargrove a long time, a man who already knew everything that would happen. Hargrove stood abruptly, hand shaking but trying to look fierce. "What do you want?" His voice rang out. "Bumpy, not because of my mother, because of the kid you hanged and called an accident." Hargrove's face went from pale to bruised red. "Yeah? You don't know anything," he protested, but his voice collapsed as he said it. Bumpy didn't reply. Hargrove backed up until his back hit the wall, eyes wide like seeing the past. He tried to bury for 3 years. The silence lasted only seconds, but to those in the room, it felt like a lifetime. Then knock, knock, 3 firm, decisive knocks. Hargrove blurted, "He's here. I knew it." But the front door didn't open by the hand he thought. When it burst open, flashlight shone straight in his face, and a clear shout rang. "FBI, hands out!" Hargrove froze, not from being surrounded, but from realizing the one knocking wasn't Bumpy Johnson. He screamed, "No, this is my house. I'm not going anywhere." But the scream drowned as 3 agents rushed in, pinning him to the floor. The 2 remaining Klan guys were taken down in seconds, hands cuffed behind. A U.S. Marshal read him rights, while an FBI agent snapped cold silver cuffs on him. Ignoring screams, struggles, heels banging wood, they didn't stop. This wasn't a fight. This was an arrest, and Hargrove understood that hurt worse than any blow, because he once believed he stood above the law, above fear, above this whole country. In the corner, Bumpy stood watching, silent, like witnessing the world's scales return to balance. And right then, amid clinking cuffs and agents' commands, Hargrove understood what he never dared think. This wasn't the revenge the Klan ever faced. This was justice. Justice doesn't yell. Justice didn't chase him through 4 states. Justice just stood still at the exact end point and waited for him to walk right in. 12 years after the Jackson, Mississippi night under federal siege, Henry Red Jack Hargrove died quietly in a federal prison in Louisiana. A death that passed as if the world forgot he ever existed. Prison buried him in a far corner of the cemetery, only a small stone marked with inmate number and date of death. No one from the Klan visited. He once thought himself immortal in others' fear, but in the end he left the world as a name no one bothered to record. Then, the next morning, the cemetery guard found a single black rose on his grave. Just one black rose neatly placed on the still dewy soil. People asked all day, who did it? Someone from the Klan? An enemy? Or some strange thing? But the old guard just shook his head. He'd heard of a man from Harlem who didn't believe in revenge by bullets, only in balance. A black rose, just enough to close one chapter of his life. After Hargrove's arrest, federal court seized most of the South Carolina KKK chapter's assets: land, warehouses, secret donation funds, protection money collected for years. What once spread fear was redirected under hands of those wanting to rewrite the story. From that money, the Cornelius Johnson Scholarship Fund was born, named for the young reporter who died in Santee Forest. Scholarships for black students pursuing journalism, those wanting to speak truth the system once tried to bury. Each year, when a new class was accepted, people saw a man in a black suit and dark fedora standing at the back of the auditorium. No one dared ask his name, but everyone knew who he was. In Harlem, life went on. The streets he once walked stayed crowded, noisy, full of small stories of survival and dignity. The vendor in front of his old address said every time Bumpy passed, he paused a few seconds to watch kids play ball on the sidewalk, as if confirming Harlem was still safe. He no longer intervened deeply like before. He no longer sought power like in his youth. He stayed in Harlem like a quiet shadow, but anyone who ever caused trouble in the neighborhood knew one thing: that shadow still watched. People in the area called him by the old name, softly like a vow: the Balancer. It wasn't a bestowed title. It was Harlem's way of acknowledging that sometimes this city stood firm because one man knew the limits humans must not cross. When the city slept, sometimes Bumpy stood alone on his front stoop, lighting a cigar and looking toward the horizon. No one knew what he thought then. Maybe he remembered Cornelius, maybe his mother, maybe he just watched life turn. But in those eyes always lay something heavy as history and sharp as the blade of justice. Harlem elders say some debts can only be paid by collapse, not blood. Some insults carry consequences through a lifetime, like a stone thrown into still water rippling forever. And one thing all Harlem knows: Bumpy Johnson's mother is sacred, untouchable. Just once, enough to change the fate of anyone who dared try. If you want to read more noir, history, dramatic stories like this, please subscribe so you don't miss out. See you in the next journeys, full of darkness and justice.